Hello, my name's Steve Barrett. Welcome to PR Week Live. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of PR Week, and we're going to talk about reputation today. Big topic of conversation. You can't have failed to have noticed one of the biggest stories in the media for decades involving News Corporation, and we've got the perfect man to talk about it, Mike Paul from MGP and Associates, otherwise known as the Reputation Doctor. Mike, welcome. Good to have you here. Reputation, I mean, what a story this has been. It's played out for a number of weeks, hasn't it? I mean, if you'd been in on this at the start, what would your advice have been to News Corporation and Rupert Murdoch? Because, I mean, at the start of this, we probably didn't think that it was even going to spread over to the US. It was a local difficulty with the News of the World, one of News International's papers in the UK, obviously the same group as Fox and Wall Street Journal. But it was a local story. What would your advice have been at the start if you'd been at that top table?
Well, thanks, Steve, for having me here at PR Week. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Well, the first thing I would say is that there's some experience that would initially jump in, which is an initial strategy is certainly not going to be the strategy for the long haul. Why? Because it's the second largest media conglomerate in the world. There's so many bits and pieces that this is tied to. Even those in the beginning who said, well, we're going to try and keep this a news international story. Of course, my first advice would be that's never going to happen. It's already an international story on day one. And one of the reasons why we know it was is because there is a conflict between conservative news and liberal news. Some believe that those things don't even exist. Obviously, others believe that it does exist. And that caused the entire world to say, whether they thought it was a top story or not, we've got to cover this, and we have to cover this in a big way.
Do you think it's different because it was a media group that was involved, and obviously there are implications here for our industry, the communications industry, because the credibility of that whole media was brought into question?
Well, and it will continue to be in question. You know, one of the things that's happening now is that they are saying that there are many other papers that have done so, and they're looking at Fleet Street, which is the equivalent of, you know, the main street in London that has a lot of these newspapers. But guess what? When we look at that in the US, every news organization should say, my gosh, have we done anything like this? It's an opportunity for us to do an audit and find out. And we should be finding it first before someone else does. And if we have, obviously, from a reputation perspective, it's best for you to say it in your way and get it out in front of it, versus the legal strategy, which would say, you're absolutely crazy. We're not going to say anything. They're going to have to find it. And that's the oil and water that happens constantly within a situation like this. The court of law versus the court of public opinion.
Can media titles recover? Can they recover their reputation over time?
I think it's an opportunity for, as I said before, every news organization to really be humble themselves and to not just point fingers and say, my gosh, if we have someone take a media microscope on ourselves, from a legal perspective, from a media perspective, from a reputation perspective, from an ethical perspective, will we pass the smell test? I mean, ironically, a lot of this is tied to politics. Many of the rules that we use in crisis PR and reputation management come from the political world first, and we've transferred them to the corporate world. If you're a political candidate and you find out, for example, that someone had cheated on their taxes and it's campaign time, and obviously the campaign crew says it's time for us to cut a commercial. Well, guess what? If you're going to cut that commercial and you haven't checked your own taxes first, that would obviously be a very big mistake.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that ironically I've had in my past in working for some elected officials, that very example.
Yeah, I mean, finally on that subject, I mean, the story finally seems to be fading away due to some other tragic stories over the weekend. But
for a moment.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, really. They still need to be on their guard, they still need to be thinking reputation, because this could rear its head again quite easily.
Oh, not only will it, you have to prepare for it. And the best way to prepare for it is to have a timeline. What are the various hearings that are going to be coming up in the future? There's a proactive and a reactive timeline. The things you know that you certainly put in those dates, and you prepare for those things to be upticks in the news. Whether it's a government hearing, whether it's a legal hearing, and then the things that you can't control, that you try and anticipate, are thrown into there. One of the things would be, what's going to happen to these other newspapers? When other newspapers are thrown into the mix and they find different types of information that are still unethical. What's going to be our answers to those questions? How do we anticipate and prepare for that? That's part of the job of certainly the crisis PR and reputation management teams. But the big issue that goes along with this also is there's so many players involved. And I'm just talking about the firms, the PR firms. Who's in charge is a key question. And if it's broken up into pieces, trust me, there's a lot of dissension there behind the scenes.
That's interesting because there have been 3 or 4 different agencies mentioned, haven't there, in different areas in providing counsel.
And there are those that are close to the Murdochs personally. There are those that are close to James personally. There are those that haven't been mentioned that are certainly part of the mix, with Freud, Elizabeth's husband, certainly having an active role that he doesn't like to be mentioned in the media. There's certainly a role for Roger Ailes, who has been absolutely quiet on this issue. Roger Ailes is one of the best strategists in the world. He comes from political seeds. He used to work for some of the people I work for here in New York before I was even born. I mean, this is a man who gets it. And if you don't think that he's heavily involved with strategy to his boss, well, I think we're not that naive.
Okay, well, Mike, thanks for sharing those insights. Good to hear. I think we can safely say this one's got a fair way to run yet, but thanks for that insight on the biggest story of the year as far as we're concerned.
Thanks, Steve.